crashing the international financial system, which would definitely reduce our imports through a recession, through a very weak dollar, and through much higher interest rates. And, I don't see that that's in his interest. I don't think it's in America's interest, and I'm not sure it's in anybody else's interest, because losing the international financial system would be a fairly big step.
Okay, thank you, David. I will do a bilingual now, so to give you a break. Waves, I will speak in Vietnamese first.
Yes.
Bây giờ mình còn rất nhiều câu hỏi ở đây. Thì hồi nãy thầy có nói về vấn đề là Trung Quốc có thể đẩy hàng vào Việt Nam khi họ không xuất được qua Mỹ. Thì thầy có chia sẻ gì về nỗi lo của doanh nghiệp Việt Nam trong việc phải cạnh tranh với hàng hóa Trung Quốc ở các thị trường khác? Có cơ hội nào cho doanh nghiệp Việt Nam hay không? Câu hỏi thứ hai là các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam xuất khẩu sang Mỹ sẽ cần chuẩn bị gì trong giai đoạn này để đối phó với tình huống đàm phán sắp tới nếu trường hợp thuế quan mà Mỹ sẽ giảm là không đáng kể. So we have two questions relating to the Vietnamese market, and Vietnamese businesses. As you mentioned earlier, that there's a possibility that China will export more to other countries rather than the US. So what do you think about Vietnamese businesses when they have to compete with that? I mean, with that flux of Chinese goods from across the border. Is there any chance for them to survive? That's the first question.
It depends on government policy, obviously. If you find ways to protect them, I mean, this is a product by product question. It's not a macro question. There are some products where I think Vietnam, either because its labor is cheaper or because it has, a narrow advantage in supplying local FDI firms that are exporting and have close relations with them. If you want to help, Toyota make parts for their cars and have the right quality and scale and so on, I think that they might decide to get local production rather than import from China. That's the sort of thing where I think it would be possible to compete. But in general, China has a huge market. It has industrial subsidies, and it has a lot of competition in China. And that mixture is extremely difficult to compete with unless you partner up with Japan or Korea or maybe an EU company or something, get technology and use that technology to become competitive. And I think there are certainly things where you can do that. But again, this is a product by product question. It's, in general, competing with China is very difficult. And now, of course, the government, can find ways to, procure locally or something, it can do certain things to help make some inputs cheaper. With Vingroup, I think, between the real estate, construction, government contracts and so on, it's giving indirect subsidies, which help it. That's another way to do it. But basically, it's trench warfare. You need to figure out how to survive in a very, very competitive framework.
Okay, the next question, Dũng không có dịch. The next question is, what should we do? I mean, Vietnamese businesses to prepare for this situation when the negotiation, fail, or even the tariff that the U.S. will reduce is not significant. What should they do, in your opinion? And
in my opinion, I would plan on modestly higher tariffs, but not only on Vietnam. In other words, I think there will end up being higher tariffs under President Trump, I think they'll be at least 10%, they might be 15, but they, I think most countries, including the countries you compete with, will pay that too, and you won't be singled out. Now, if you take that as your base case, then you can at least plan what a sensible investment strategy would be. I'm a little surprised that Vietnamese business has not, sort of integrated more with the FDI firms who would love to procure locally, many, at least third tier supply type stuff, not maybe a first or second tier, but supplier, which tend, to be companies that follow them. I mean, FDI companies often follow Toyota or Samsung or Intel, and produce inputs for their exports. But a second or third tier, might just be producing simpler parts, but still to quality specifications and specific scale at the right time. That's not easy, getting qualified for that. But, Vietnamese companies are very capable of doing that. And I think the government has to make it easier for those companies, and the companies themselves have to be, stop the stay small, stay short, never tell the truth business, and try to grow, plug into some very, very large potential markets domestically, which feed then into world markets through exports.
Okay. The next question is, President Trump wants U.S. business to come back home, and build factories. But would that be the U.S. competitiveness?
No.
In terms of cost, and do you think it's a good strategy for the U.S.?
No.
Cái câu hỏi là Tổng thống Trump muốn Mỹ quay trở lại sản xuất nhiều hơn, các doanh nghiệp quay trở lại sản xuất nhiều hơn. Thì liệu đây có phải là lợi thế cạnh tranh hay là về mặt chi phí không? Và có phải là chiến lược tốt cho Mỹ không? Please, David.
Yeah, look, as I said, we have a low unemployment rate. The native population is not, the birth rate is below, is like 1.6 or something. Kids per woman. The inflow of migrants has been largely stopped, or at least reduced, and there are probably 5 or 10 million workers who are not fully documented, but are and have been for decades contributing to the workforce. If you send a large number, millions of workers home, you don't let new ones in, and the domestic workforce is fully employed and not growing, you don't start sewing T-shirts. That doesn't work. And, one of the first things we teach, or I taught in development economics, is a tax on imports is a tax on exports. If Boeing has to pay higher aluminum prices, that makes it more expensive than Airbus. If machine tools use a lot of specialty steel and that's more expensive, they're more expensive in world markets. The really good export jobs that are high wage and high tech are taxed by the policies that Trump is doing. This is why most economists don't think it's a very good idea. And I could give you, I've worked now, 50 years in Southeast Asia. I can give you chapter and verse, not now, of examples of when tariffs were reduced, all sorts of new export opportunities arose because you could get world-priced inputs. And so, to answer your question, it makes no sense to tax labor-intensive exports, which the U.S. cannot possibly, produce themselves, unless you think robots are going to take over. Now, the robots are getting cheaper, they are getting more capable. And, at some point, it may be that a lot of clothing and shoes are made by robots, and then, who knows where they'll be located. But it won't be many workers. And why you would want t-shirts made in one place versus another. I mean, pharmaceuticals, chips, computer chips, that I understand. Small yard, high fence, I get that. But this is a completely different policy, and I don't think it is logical.
Okay, thank you, David. I think we still have a few minutes left because we start a little bit late, 5 minutes, so allow me to make it until 9:05 your time, right? Okay. So the last question, I will speak again in Vietnamese first. Mình còn có vài phút thôi, cho nên là tôi nghĩ là mình sẽ có một cái câu hỏi cuối, và câu hỏi này tôi nghĩ liên quan trực tiếp đến cái việc mà chính phủ Việt Nam chúng ta đang làm, đó là đàm phán với chính phủ Mỹ, hoặc bằng cách nào đàm phán với chính phủ Mỹ, ở kênh nào, hay là cần chuẩn bị gì để đạt được cái kết quả như thầy chia sẻ. Thì không biết thầy có chia sẻ hay là có lời khuyên gì giả định là nếu thầy được hỏi là chính phủ Việt Nam nên làm gì để chuẩn bị cho cuộc đàm phán này. Okay, the last question would be that what is your advice if you are asked to the Vietnamese government when they negotiate with the Trump administration? What should they prepare? What front they need to operate? What allies they need to come to, or who they should call for help? Thank you.
Right. I would hire some law firms with close ties to the Trump administration. They're lobbyists. They go to the Trump people and explain what we've been talking about in ways that make it seem obvious that Vietnam is not the problem. Vietnam puts together things other people make, and don't single out Vietnam, because they happen to be a little bit better at putting things together. If you're going to put a tariff on people, put it on everybody, make it 10 or 15%, and life will go on. Okay, don't argue against the general idea of a tariff, because that's hopeless. But get treated equally and keep the tariff as low as possible. And then, if there are factories that are not really factories, but just putting Vietnamese labels and Chinese goods, cooperate completely with the US on investigations. If they say, we want to look at that factory, say, yes, absolutely. It's in your interest to close down the factories that are sort of just diverting trade and not really changing production. If there are specific things like ethanol, negotiate that. It won't make much difference. You might even open some of those ethanol factories in Vietnam. I think there are 6 or 8 of them, and they're mostly closed, using cassava and so on. Just allowing more ethanol doesn't mean more ethanol imports. It might mean some of your factories reopen. And in general, talk to Republicans in Congress, explain why you think that it makes sense for the Vietnam and the U.S. to cooperate rather than have antagonistic relationships. You should do it with the Democrats too, but they already believe it. That they're not the problem by and large, although some labor unions might be. If someone comes from Louisiana, they'll be nervous about shrimp. But the U.S. 90% of the shrimp the U.S. consumes is imported. So maybe with tariffs 15% will be domestically supplied. But there are things like that you can work through, and they're not large. This is something where there's a very substantial relationship American firms or firms working for American companies have made huge commitments to Vietnam in terms of factories and labor training and so on. And it's in no one's interest, including the US interest, to mess that up. You might change it on the margins, but at the end of the day, who benefits if you double the price of a T-shirt? I don't see any sensible outcome in that. And I think at the end of the day, Vietnam is both skillful enough and in a good enough place, because it is a low-cost alternative to China, that it can benefit from the Chinese tariffs and continue exporting at a high level, or maybe not as fast growing, but at a high level to the US. And that's my hope, and that's what I would shoot for in negotiations.
Thank you so much. I think 1 hour has passed, and I will switch to Vietnamese. Các bạn thân mến, mình đã hết 1 tiếng đồng hồ. Thì chúng ta rất cảm ơn thầy David đã dành thời gian chia sẻ. Thì thật ra thầy David có viết một cái bài ngắn để trình bày với Phó Thủ tướng Phớt, nhưng mà thầy cũng đồng ý là để tôi chia sẻ lại với các bạn, đặc biệt là cái phần liên quan đến cách mà ứng phó với cái mức thuế mà chính quyền Trump đặt ra. Thì tôi sẽ chuyển lại cái bài đó cho các bạn sau cái buổi này. Một lần nữa chúng ta cảm ơn thầy David và mời các bạn chúng ta mở camera lên ra. Trung ơi, em có thể làm một cái screenshot để chụp mọi người được không?
Dạ được thầy. Để
David,
mở
thank
lên
you
em
so much.
screenshot.